Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nick Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university.
Hey, this is Nick. Zach, how are you doing today?
I am doing pretty good. Today, we're talking about assessment.
Oh boy.
Yeah, everybody's absolute favorite.
Can't wait.
Yeah. You want to get faculty together for a good time, just put a sign that says assessment outside the room and they'll just arrive.
Absolutely.
Build it and they will come. No, it is about everybody's least favorite activity and topic at the university, except for a few true sociopaths.
So about a year ago, we published an article in Inside Higher Ed where we said that AI has broken assessment. So just walk us through a little bit of our argument in that piece.
Yeah, so if you can imagine back in time, this was spring 24. Nick and I were looking around across the landscape, realizing that some students were using AI and some students weren't, and that faculty members at our institution, but across the country, were being encouraged, right? Oh, have your policy in the syllabus. And that's all sort of okay if you consider each class its own sort of isolated ecosystem. But aggregated assessment doesn't do that. And so if you're unfamiliar, aggregated assessment, the idea is that we're going to look at all the students in a major or at a university or in a program of study and figure out, are they learning a couple of things, right? A key chemistry concept, proficiency in public speaking, rudimentary writing skill, whatever it is, we're going to look at students across a bunch of different sections, possibly different majors, and figure out, are these students learning? And so one of the things that Nick and I were speculating was that AI completely breaks this apart, because if in Nick's class, he says, we're using AI for everything, and let's do it, and we're all in, you have to have a ChatGPT subscription to be in my class. And in my class, I'm like, AI is devil magic, and I'm going to run this through every conceivable AI detector. If you even say the word AI, I'm calling university police. And then 5 of our colleagues don't even want to think about it, so they don't have the policy. How on earth are you going to take the stuff from all those classes and dump it out on a table and be like, let's take the average of all of this? It does not make any sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, when we say assessment, we are not talking about individual grading. This is like a university program-wide thing where you're assessing the learning objectives or outcomes for students. So the data is basically bad, is what fundamentally our argument was at the core. And yet we were still expected to do it. So over the last 2 years, assessment reports, assessment teams, coordinators, chairs, whoever's doing it are gathering the data and they're running it through a team to assess it, or they're doing it themselves and they're giving that. So what's the bigger stake? Why are we doing that? Who wants this data anyways?
Yeah, so this data goes towards a couple of different things. A lot of programs and all universities are accredited, so they are responsive to a larger body. Maybe it's the business accreditation unit that accredits all business programs in the United States, or it's the Western accrediting body WASC that we report to on the West Coast. But lots of times we're reporting out to those different bodies because they have standards that we are supposed to meet as institutions. And one of the things that we noticed when we were looking around, because we both thought, these are the people that should be leading this conversation, right? Like, it's not us. We can't make changes in this space. Those big accrediting bodies are supposed to be the connective tissue that bring together what's happening in the classroom, demands from the private sector, and then public sector and government standards, right? Like, they're supposed to be merging all those things together and then providing universities guidance for what it is that we were supposed to do. And so we went to a bunch of websites expecting to find some guidance, but what did we find instead?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
I think the Northwest group had some articles. And to be fair, since then, some of these organizations have started having conferences or having this as a theme and communication that they're sending to campuses.
But to our credits, we published this piece a year ago in 2024. ChatGPT came out in the fall of 22. So a year and a half had gone by, and there was maybe one institution that had taken it seriously. Nobody on our campus, I think we even had conversations, maybe even made some presentations, deer in the headlights on this stuff. But it does look like some of the accrediting agencies have made changes in the last year to start moving on this. Is that right?
Yeah. 3 years in, and we're seeing some conference panel presentations. So it really speaks to the agility and rapid reaction of these institutions.
Yeah, and he's being sarcastic because this is one of our contentions, and we're not going to really get into it today, but the university moves very slow in all capacities. And that's maybe we'll talk about it in another episode. So we've seen that, but the daily grind continues. So let me just talk a little bit about my experience on the front lines in a department, sociology. My chair is doing so much work, but one of the things, since budget cuts, there's no more assessment committee, there's no more release time for assessment, so it still has to get done. So here we are, 3 years into the generative AI revolution, and we're still collecting data, basically bad data, and we're still producing reports. So my chair we assessed writing. So the university needed to assess student writing capabilities. And so she got all the papers, and it was pretty clear right away, just from reading them on the first pass, that these were really good. And when she got the data back after assessing all of them, over 90% of our students were proficient or exceeded proficiency levels. There's just no way. That's not how this works, that we don't have every student at proficiency or above proficiency. So it really indicated, like, we've got this junk data, we've got this junk report, but we still have to turn it in, and somebody is doing something with it. It's some piece of actionable material at some point, or is it? I mean,
yeah, Nick, you really put your finger on it, and this goes back to the initial piece that we wrote, which is that there's no break in this cycle, right? You're just supposed to do it on this ongoing, relentless basis in the quest for self-improvement. So the problem is that when we're faced with a rupture like this, there's no built-in mechanism that allows us to say, okay, so that doesn't work anymore. Let's try out something else. And it's one of the reasons why we had that recommendation in the initial article of institutions should take a 1-year pause.
Yeah.
And we should be given breathing room by accrediting bodies to not stop the work of assessment, but stop collecting all this trash data and pretending that it's meaningful, and rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it.
And frankly, we pitched that to the university, to deans, and to the committees that do this, that oversee this kind of work. It didn't happen. So here we are a year later, the assessment's continuing on. It's the same problem. I mean, have you heard of are there any examples out there of institutions that have tried something different?
Yeah. So the folks from one university, Stony Brook on Long Island, New York, they read our piece, and in October of last year, they had me out to give a talk at their assessment conference that they run for the university. And it was awesome. Shout out to those people. They're absolutely fantastic. Great organization. And those are people that are really taking assessment seriously. One of the reasons they had me out was that they were attracted to the idea of the pause. They were changing their assessment cycles. So they had this natural, I think it was 14-month window built into their assessment cycle. And so they were having these conversations. What should we do with this breathing room? They saw our piece, and then they wanted to know, if you have this year pause, what do you do in that pause? And so you and I talked through some of the possibilities about what could be done and couldn't be done. And it's my understanding that they have implemented some of those pieces, or at least started that conversation. And so that was really refreshing for me, to be at a place where people were willing to say, okay, we were doing something, it doesn't work the same way that it used to, let's take a break and figure it out. And I don't want to be too critical of the people that we work with at Chico State, right? Like, they are well-intentioned. And the big thing is, they don't get to make the decision about what WASC does and what they're asking for, right? Yeah. We can all push and pull in our areas, but they're responding to a different set of people that they don't have control over, just like you and I are.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just another example where the technology is not necessarily replacing, or it can replace, some of these things that we continue to do on the university, but it actually is highlighting the areas that they just don't work anymore. And so in our conversations, whenever we present this to people would raise their hand or speak up and say, you know what, assessment was always broken. And to that we agree. But the generative AI really forcefully shows you how and which ways it's broken, and actually breaks it even more in new ways, right? So I mean, a year later, I still think we should be talking about this. We should be doing new things, right? On all campuses. That's not something that we're saying, okay, now let's just move on to something else, right? But in the year since we published that piece, AI has advanced even more. So I don't know, how do you see the changes, not only in the capabilities of the models, but now their proliferation into all kinds of software and operating systems? What are your thoughts? How is that kind of reanimating our discussion around assessment?
Yeah, so like you said, the pivoting from the piece that we wrote to what's happened in the year since, there's been so much. And part of it is a disciplinary proliferation, right? Because when you and I were first fooling around with these things and trying to bring their attention to other people, we were mainly talking about writing. And I know that's when things showed up for you in your class, and people have been concerned about that from the start. But then these systems have gotten so much better at STEM disciplines, specifically at math, in the last 18 months, even to the point where I work closely with one of our information technology consultants, and she also teaches in mathematics. And when we started working together, these things were garbage at doing even basic stuff.
Remember that? People were like, oh, it can't do math.
Right. Yeah, and we've heard that over and over again. Oh, these things can write, but they can't write with emotion, or they can't write reflection, or they can't do math, or they can't do science, or they can't draw. And then 2 months later, you're wrong about that too. Yeah. And so that's been one of the things, is that we've seen this explode into all of these other areas. And the other thing is that we're in the middle of a generational shift right now, in that one of the things that's so different from when we wrote this a year ago is that the students that are in classes at a university right now, they have had access to powerful large language models for 2.5 years at this point. At this point, next year, we will have students graduating that have had access to ChatGPT for virtually their entire time that they were a university student, right? And so that doesn't just mean that then they're using it more, but it is becoming a sort of natural place where work gets done for a swath of students. And the issue is we still have a bunch of students that don't want to use it, or their professors are telling them not to use it, but you can't put all that data together. It's silly.
Yeah. And even go, so it's not, so the students are becoming more adept at using it, and they're using it in all new ways, right? And the models themselves are getting more powerful. But we've also written, and others have, to say that actually the tools, AI is becoming more and more embedded in every piece of software we use. I remember, like, what was in the fall, I opened up my PDF organizer, and it's had this big shiny thing that says, now new AI assistant. So I could basically do the Notebook LM stuff right in my PDF organizer. Students open up, their Apple iPhone, and it now has Apple AI that can do some basic LLM rewriting, cleanup, that kind of stuff, right? So it's being, integrated into all the technology, all the software operating systems. And also, at the time of this recording, CSU system has already purchased a license to ChatGPT EDU, and our institution at CSU Chico is implementing that this month in April 2025. So every student, faculty, staff is now going to have the EDU license, which gives everybody not just the 4.0, but I also believe the 4.5 and all the image and everything, right? Pretty incredible.
Yeah, and even beyond the CSU, ChatGPT just opened up premium version for every student, basically everybody with a .edu email address for the rest of the semester. So that's going to shift even further how work gets done. So to think that we're not going to shift how we evaluate that work, either in our classes individually or how we're going to evaluate that work in aggregate, is absolutely ridiculous. I've talked to faculty members at numerous institutions who tell me they are, at this point when they're getting stuff, whether it's writing or math work or whatever it is that they're evaluating, say, I know I'm just getting mainly AI work at this point. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things, getting back to the initial piece that we wrote, is that we're no longer assessing student learning, right? If we ever were, like you said earlier. What we're assessing now is some mix of student work, AI work, and a student working with AI, like you just said a minute ago, Nick. In some cases, maybe not even knowing that they're using that. Mm-hmm. I mainly use Google Docs for content creation. The autocomplete feature has gotten so much better in the last 18 months than it ever was before, and it's because it has pieces of Gemini that are powering the back end to do little limited pieces of production. My writing has gotten better in that time because something will show up and I'll think, oh, well, that wasn't the word I was going to choose. I think it's probably actually better. I'll use that instead. Right.
Yeah. So faculty are using it, students are using it, and I think one of the conversations around assessment also led us back into the conversation around our student learning outcomes to begin with. And I think that ChatGPT's introduction and all these models have really should be forcing us to go back to the beginning. What are we teaching? Why are we teaching it? What's its purpose? What are the student learning outcomes? Because the ones we created in the 1960s and 70s, because that's one thing I found when I was doing this background on this, is that our executive memorandum, is that what it's called, the EM, dates back to the 1970s on the writing proficiency. So we're assessing writing proficiency on standards that were developed in the 1970s. And I think that it's probably time to redo that kind of basic, what are we wanting our students to learn? What kind of skills do they need now?
Any university policy that was made before Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope needs to be thrown out. I think that's my major takeaway.
Absolutely. So, yes. At the end of the piece we wrote published last year, we had our 1-year pause idea. But okay, now we're a year later from that. One thing we did say, should we just give up? I mean, is assessment even worth it? I mean, what are we doing? I mean, seriously, people are wasting their time right now, literally right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is funny. And do you remember several times we were doing that, talking to people, and there was at least one person in several items that they were just like, yes, that's what we should be doing right now.
That was kind of sometimes a crowd pleaser.
Yeah, it was. People at our campus and others keep talking about doing less with less. And I think that's a less that a lot of people would like to do. Yeah. And we kind of included that in there flippantly, like, what you're doing right now is silly, so either give up or we've got to do something different. But I don't know. Maybe it's more serious now than it was a year ago. And maybe assessment is even less meaningful. Maybe giving up is something that we need to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would still call for a pause, because I think the real work needs to be doing and the student learning outcome conversation, which is a different part of the university, right? The writing requirement and all that kind of stuff, all the way down to the department level, even the faculty. What do you want your students to learn? So, okay, that's our conversation on assessment is broken. All right, so we have a new segment this episode called Bad Analogies, where we'll kind of explore all the different ways that people use analogies to talk about artificial intelligence. Now, you've probably heard of it's just a calculator analogy. And sometimes I'm kind of attracted to that. But, in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, what kind of analogy is that? What is it doing? What is it saying? And that's why I was asking, Zach, is that a bad analogy? It's just a calculator?
Yes, Nick. That is a bad analogy, a perfect fit for the first segment of bad analogies. So I'm certainly too young for this because I'm in my mid-20s. I'm not in my mid-20s, but a lot of people that we work with, and certainly you can go back through newspaper archives, were in math departments or were math departments at a moment when the handheld calculator became a sort of a part of everyday life. And so then there was backlash from math instructors. There are some humorous protests of people walking around with protest signs against calculators. It's awesome because they're all in short sleeve dress shirts and smoking. It was very much of the time. That's how I want our protests to look from now on. Short sleeve dress shirts, cigarettes. So it's a bad analogy because the calculator is an awesome tool, and it certainly made doing arithmetic easier. Arithmetic is a sort of small piece of the puzzle. It's even a small piece of mathematics. ChatGPT and large language models are replacing entire fields and impacting entire fields of study, virtually all knowledge work, including mathematics. So the first reason it's a bad analogy is that it completely underestimates the amount of scale that we are dealing with here. If you were in an English department when the calculator was introduced, you probably thought, "Oh, interesting, doesn't really impact my life. I'm going to go on with my day." And I think in the early days of large language models, when especially people in English departments or people like us that have taught writing were up in arms about this, I think maybe some people that worked in STEM were kind of like, "Oh, well, I guess today's your day for this." But it turns out today is everybody's day because the scale of disruption for this is absolutely enormous. It doesn't even belong in the same conversation with something that replaces a small part of function of one particular field of study. Instead, it's all of us all the time in everything that we study.
So you don't really buy this idea that large language models and artificial intelligence it's just a progression of technological tools such as the internet, the personal computer, and that it's just more of the same kind, not of a different kind.
Well, I'm not sure. I can certainly see part of it as an extension of sophisticated database management. And, you look at some of the crude algorithms in the early models, and they are just predictive models for like, what is the next token in this? But here's another real break with that analogy. People that are programmers, they understand how calculators work. You can look at old calculators in the form of vacuum tubes in computers that filled an entire room. No one, not even the people working at the labs, understand how large language models work. Mm. I don't want to say that they are intelligent. I don't want to say that they are creative. I know that that's especially fraught territory. But when the people working at the labs can't really put their finger on why is it that this is able to do this? Why is it that it is able to accomplish a task that it was not trained to do? We're not looking at a fancy calculator. We're looking at something that is entirely different. And that is why it is so disruptive, not just to what we study, but also what you talked about earlier, what students need to know and learn for when they're out either participating in civic life or in their professional lives. And that's why that's a bad analogy.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintoair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintoair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nick Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintoair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.